So thank you, Ashoka Canada, for meeting with us. It's great to spend some time with you to do a little bit of a deep dive on some issues that are important to the MOOC and the people who are watching the MOOC, because you live it every day with the fellows you support and the kind of advocacy work you're doing to scale social entrepreneurship and change making, right? So I will invite you to maybe introduce yourself and what your role is with the organization, but then also to maybe tell a bit of a story about how you got to today. Like, what was your path? That's maybe a little bit more colorful than a resume might suggest.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
it's really exciting to
great
be
to be here.
You want to go first?
Sure. Okay. So my name is Claudia Simone. I'm Director of Partnerships for Ashoka Canada. So I lead partnership development, new initiatives, and fundraising. My path. I'm trained as a journalist, so I did that for a short while and decided that I wanted to make a bigger social impact. It wasn't really fitting the kind of impact I was looking to have, and so I decided to take a year and study Afro-Brazilian percussion and cover the World Social Forum and do some volunteering in Brazil and study Portuguese. So I learned a new language in my 20s. So I did that for 4 months and came back and had lots of questions and decided I wanted to study some more. So I did a master's in environmental studies with a focus on Latin American and Caribbean studies, and had some really deep questions about systemic challenges in the world, and had the opportunity to do a field experience in Brazil where I was working with women community health workers who were like super agents of change in their community and really using entrepreneurial skills to create tri-sectoral partnerships and bring recycling to their community that you couldn't even access by car. So working with catadores, which are informal garbage collectors, and as community health workers, they would go to each house and ask people about their health to follow up, and at the same time say, well, we're doing this recycling project, why don't you talk to the local garbage collector? And slowly, little by little, they got thousands of people to start putting out their garbage and created the system of garbage collection, and they created partnerships with the city and everything. So it was, we were helping to facilitate that, but that's what introduced me to social entrepreneurship, and I learned about Ashoka and have been involved ever since.
So how many years have you been with the organization?
About 7.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
And I'm Elisha Muskat. I'm the Executive Director of Ashoka Canada after a winding journey with Ashoka. So I've been with the organization for, 5 years and change, and came in on Claudia's first mat leave. So I always feel very connected to her son because of that. He got me in the door. But I had done a lot of work in youth development, and after graduating from my undergrad, I moved down to New York, and I was working running an after-school program and then in health education, but both were very connected to the school systems there. And I started to see, I had friends working in the same fields, and we'd be competing for the same grants, and we'd run complementary programs, but none of it was connected. So I got interested in what I thought was education policy, decided to do an MBA, and quickly dropped the policy piece because I thought that government maybe wasn't the right field for me. And then I actually took courses on complexity theory, the one that was developed by Brenda Zimmerman, who we miss very much, and taught by Brian Hayday, who we also miss very much, and completely fell in love with the approach that they were teaching, and with the idea of trying to navigate through complex social change and how the world is really, between changing demographics, and we're just at this point where things are happening very differently in the world from how they have been for the last few hundred years, and we need to organize and manage differently within that. So fell in love with that, found Ashoka through that path, started volunteering and eventually working here, but really connected to that idea that old approaches don't work anymore, and we need new ways of navigating the world that's emerging.
That's a great story too. So thanks again for being with me. Sometimes I have students that are asking me about, the donations that get made to a shelter, for example, a homeless shelter, and then the person that organizes the homeless shelter and runs it, and then the person who studies and wants to make change for why is there a need for a homeless shelter in the first place. So how does Ashoka look at those three levels?
Sure, so maybe I could start
Sure.
on that. So we talk about different levels of change at the direct service level, and then looking at larger scaled impact, and then at framework change and mindset shift. So we look at those inflection points, and what you've described as three separate initiatives that are maybe on the same scale to ending homelessness. So we need to be providing direct supports to people who are currently living on the streets or without a home. We need to be supporting the people who are running the supports. And then we need to be investing in looking for different kinds of solutions. So Ashoka sees them as either three separate initiatives or three steps on the same curve. And when we elect social entrepreneurs as fellows, we're definitely looking at people who are developing approaches that are really far along that curve. So they're really looking at changing, looking at what the root causes are, and looking at a completely different way of addressing that root cause. So it completely shifts the nature of the field. So maybe eventually those direct services won't be needed, but it doesn't mean that we discount the need for those direct services. So maybe I'll start that as a framework and see if Claudia wants to add.
Yeah, so Ashoka recognizes the importance of direct service, but we really focus on the systems level, and we do that a few different ways. The Ashoka Fellows, selecting Ashoka Fellows that have new ideas for solving systemic social problems. We work with institutions like universities to support them to create the next generation of change makers. And we work with schools also and businesses. So how are each of those institutions really cultivating a culture of change making and working on changing systems working on changing systems.
So what do you think are some of the assumptions that people make who are going into social entrepreneurship or the work that they come to realize in terms of systems? Like, what are some of the aha moments that you're being exposed to, or the learning that's sort of being surfaced through this work?
So one of the things we've seen, we've been electing fellows for 30 years. There are 3,000 fellows across the world, and one of the themes that this ties back to something Claudia was talking about, but something we've seen that's been a common experience for almost all fellows is they have an early experience of seeing that change is possible. So in terms of systems can feel very entrenched, and we talk about social entrepreneurs as being people who aren't fighting an existing system, but they're building a new system that people are so drawn to that they leave the old one and come to the new one. A really, I think, clear and easy example of this is Jimmy Wales, who founded Wikipedia and Wikimedia. So he was elected as a senior Ashoka Fellow for the impact he had already made at the time of his election, but people used to consult paper encyclopedias. Jimmy did not set out to take down the world of printed encyclopedias, but he created another system that has become the default system because it attracted so many people. So all Ashoka Fellows are really creating systems like that are just so attractive that they make those old systems obsolete. And many of them have some kind of early experience of seeing that something is possible, seeing that barriers are movable, and different kinds of experiences. So I always like to tell the story of Jason Potts, who founded Finance Alliance for Sustainable Trade. And he talked about how growing up in Vancouver, his family biked to Washington, D.C., and that experience of biking across the country or across the continent really, it was, it's not like a world-changing initiative that his family embarked on, but it was this like, oh, we can get there. We don't have to fly. We don't have to drive or take the train. And it shifts the way people think about what they're able to do.
We often see, I used to do fellow selection in Canada, which was really, really fun. And so we often see patterns where fellows they understand a social problem so deeply. So it might be they've experienced a trauma in their life or have lived that problem themselves in some way. And they start out by creating some initiative that is really a new reality. So they might create a new reality among the existing reality. And slowly that new reality becomes the norm, slowly. So it's not about incremental change. It's about real like systems change. So making a real dent in the way whatever system it is. So Nicole Rycroft, for example, her organization is Canopy, and what she did was she was really dedicated to protecting old growth forests, and she saw that publishers were not publishing on recycled paper, and she saw a real opportunity to influence the publishing sector, magazines, newspapers, books, to influence the big giants globally in that space. So she brought together all the CEOs in that space and slowly got the big ones to agree. And then everybody else was like, well, I want to be competing in that. Why am I not doing that? So as you're creating this new reality, everybody else is saying, well, I want to do that too. I see the benefits of that. And so that exists. You know, Nicole is one example, and now she's doing that with the fashion industry too. Yeah. She's one example, but that's what we see as a pattern. Fellows, you know, and very commonly throughout their lives, people tell them they're crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't do this. You're nuts. You're not going to make a change. But because they use these entrepreneurial mindsets, they have a new idea because they understand the problem so deeply. They have already launched in creating a social impact. They're using creative problem solving, and they have really strong ethical fiber. Those are the 5 criteria we look at for key social entrepreneurs to really create this new reality. And we believe we have a network of 3,200 of them globally in 72 countries. So they're the role models, right? This can actually happen. And now we see in Canada and globally that a new generation in universities see the potential for using change making in wherever they are.
Yeah. Those are really great examples. But if I could pick up on the Wikipedia one, only because it's a very straightforward example of how new technology enabled this to happen as well. So I'm wondering if you're seeing patterns around emerging technology, 3D printing, or even in the clean tech industries, whether or not you see a rush of social entrepreneurship happening as a result of new technologies, or people leveraging that. Are you sensing anything? Is there maybe something even new opening up that I'm not even thinking about?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot happening in the app space, in the app development space. It's hard to see some of the innovations that I've seen that are really tied to new technology feel more like a flash in the pan. Like, I'm not sure how many of those I'm seeing that are really creating a social shift. Now, that may be because some of them, it's not the individual apps, but it's the use of apps to connect people. I mean, there are ones that I think are now about 5 years old, but that are using cell technology to share real-time market information with farmers or with people who are in different parts of the supply chain, and how that's enabling them to shift the power dynamics between them and their buyers. That's an old example now. I mean, the things that, I don't know, what do you think? Like, new technologies right now. Ashoka does have global clusters of knowledge around this. And another thing is around open sourcing. There's a new fellow that was just elected in Canada, Alan Edwards, and he's getting pharmaceutical companies to open up the drug discovery process, parts of it, because he believes that we should have gotten to the cures for cancer and other chronic diseases yet, but because the companies hold the knowledge so close to their chest, when they see that a drug is not successful, they don't share that information, right? So they let everybody run the length of their trials, which is wasting a whole bunch of time and money to actually get to those solutions and cures faster. And so that's around sharing information, and I think a different model of how we understand business and IP to be valuable, or maybe not so valuable. It's not technology. So
No. Another good example, though, of another Ashoka fellow.
Well, we have lots of those.
Well, that's it. So I want to ask a global question before I spend some time on some of our thematic topics. I'm sure I know the answer, and maybe this is just me assuming too much, but you're in this work for as many years as you have been collectively together, working on this, seeing these 3,000 plus Ashoka fellows come through the ranks, because you believe in the work, and there's a critical mass that it's growing, right? Social entrepreneurship is a growing space. More people are being attracted to it. Are we getting close to a tipping point where social entrepreneurship is no longer on the fringes as another kind of entrepreneurship over there, like the little kid sister, kid brother. And what does that mean for society?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we're really close to a tipping point. If not, we've already reached the tipping point. I think that initiatives like Recode, for example, and the investment of $10 million with 18 campuses is really telling, including Ashoka U's initiative and learning networks here, and how we're looking at what is the opportunity to bring together schools that are working in social innovation and social entrepreneurship, and how can we share best practices and support them to really be role models for society. And it's interesting, just an anecdotal story. We have a bunch of amazing interns here, and the other day we were having a conversation, and they just went through 4 years of university, and throughout those 4 years, social entrepreneurship was integrated throughout their curriculum. Wow. And so 5 years ago, that was not the case at all. So it's really, in just these 5 years, it's really a different space. I think young people, well, first of all, there's so many organizations working on creating a supply of change makers. We have 55 fellows in Canada. We've identified 14 that are really cultivating a generation of empathic change makers. So, young people who really understand and practice empathy, but also have the problem-solving skills to make a difference in the world. And so as you have this huge density of young people, what happens when they go to university? They want to have that kind of experience when they go into university too. And I think just now, in the past few years, universities have realized, okay, well, young people, they're demanding something different here. They're coming in with different skills and
values, maybe.
And values even. So, we need to adapt here. And be more flexible. So I think, maybe universities are a little slower to adapt, but I think that with the, tearing down walls of access to courses like MOOCs, for example, I think it's made a huge difference for who has access to this kind of knowledge and how they can apply it in their own lives. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. In terms of your enthusiasm for the space breaking open, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I'd just add, I was going to share the same anecdote about our interns. We were practicing our pitches about Ashoka Canada and Ashoka, and one of them used this term social entrepreneurship in her pitch, and I said, as a follow-up question, great, could you explain to me what that is? And she did, and then she said afterwards, it was really funny you asked that because nobody asks that. And it really took us aback because we were like, really? I spent the first 3 years working here, spending most of my time explaining what social entrepreneurship is. But it's true. When I reflect on it, people don't ask me that anymore.
That generation.
Yeah, and it's only, a few years difference, and yet it seems to be out there. And I think one of the signs of that is that Ashoka was an early pioneer in this space, and some people say that Bill Drayton really coined the term social entrepreneurship, at least in its current iteration. And we find that if we're talking about the definition of social entrepreneurship, it's more the nuance of what we do in the field versus the nuance of what lots of other people do. So it's really about letting go of that term, which is a good indication that you're at a new phase with a term or a concept. When there are lots of competing definitions out there, when it's taken root, that people are using it in different ways. So yeah, again, this is anecdotal, but I think for both of us, we've really seen that shift in the last few years.
And just out of curiosity, it's interesting that you elect them. I'd never heard that vocabulary around that, so I'd be curious as a footnote to find out why you made the decision to use that verb. But the other thing is, since you've been exposed to so many year after year, either on the selection committee or just because you're aware of them, because you're funding them, I'm assuming again that you watch them grow and continue to be interested in the work that they do well beyond the sort of funding years that you provide support. I'm interested if any stories come to mind that will illuminate the themes that we are talking about in our MOOC. So I'll take a couple minutes just to refresh your memory on what the themes are. So one of them is design. So visioning, whether it's imagining how things could be different and then designing accordingly in order to create that change. That's one. The next one would be co-creating. So who are you bringing on board with you for the journey to have a collaborative collective intelligence around things, people who are sharing the burden and the triumph of that crazy stuff of social entrepreneurship, but then also externally the stakeholders they have to bring on board to co-create the change that you want to see. Then something around scaling. How do you take the idea? And I think in your case, you're curving it up so that it could have systems change. So I don't know if that's your definition of scale, reaching scale. So a story that comes to mind. A resourcing story of how somebody, a social entrepreneur, did something really unique and different, and it created a ripple effect in the space around social finance or impact investing or crowdfunding or leveraging or whatever. And then finally assessing, measuring impact. If you have any Ashoka stories that speak to these themes, I'd really love to hear them.
All right, I'm going to get us started with one that I think you heard earlier today.
Okay.
Which is about Tanya's sermon and the social bond that CSI is using to finance their building. Mm-hmm. Can I check in with you about if it's worth talking about that, or if you have
let's.
good...
I'm going to actually do this because we actually are they loud? How's the sound to you?
Yeah, the one I'm thinking of is Torkel's son. Is it okay if it's an international example?
Yeah.
Okay. So Torkel's son is one of our Ashoka fellows in Denmark, and he has a son with autism. Mm-hmm. And doctors and experts in the field told him throughout his son's childhood that he can just forget about his son getting a job. He just has to accept the fact that his son will not get a job. And so he refused to accept that. And he found a way, using the expertise or what young people on the autism spectrum are really good at, so repetitive tasks and really keen eye to detail, supporting them to work in tech companies, so companies that really needed that kind of eye to attention. And they found that young people with this kind of on the autism spectrum were actually more effective on these technical skills than the robots that were doing them previously. And so he has built partnerships. So this goes to one of your themes. He has built partnerships with companies who fit this profile, who are looking for these kinds of skills, and also supporting people who face barriers to employment, specifically on the autism spectrum, to be employed. So he's scaled throughout Europe and is also scaling throughout North America, and has actually moved to the U.S. With his family to really make that happen. So
do you think his scaling success story is that he found a solution to a problem that could then be used everywhere else? Yeah,
and in addition to that people were paying attention to. So it's interesting, there's sort of a timeliness to it, that autism is a big topic of conversation right now, and has been for the last couple of years, and will be for, I think for the next few years. So it was, came out of his personal experience, but it's a solution that lots of people are paying attention to. It's also connected to job creation. So one of the things that we look at in terms of the impact and the scaling, so not just how fellows are scaling and replicating their work to have a larger number of recipients or a larger number of franchises, but we look at independent replication. So do people see that idea and say, I can do a version of that? Right? So with community bonds, for instance, that other people have said, great, what other kinds of social bonds can I create?
Right.
This worked here, let me do my own version of it. So it's not about one person replicating, it's about others seeing it and copying the idea. So I think with Torkel, he's both replicated his work because there's been a demand for it, and then he's also seen other versions of this crop up. Mm-hmm. And again, in terms of letting go, it's okay, I'm gonna, even though they're not exactly my model, I'm gonna let my idea ripple out and sort of dissipate in other ways as well. Mm-hmm. One of the patterns that we see in terms of design and creation is that the work really tends to, so I'm kind of two minds on this. I've taught courses in social entrepreneurship where often you take an approach of identifying a problem and trying to come up with a new kind of solution and building something based on a quite analytic approach. Whereas a lot of fellows really develop their work based on a personal experience, and they are the people they're designing the solution for. So like Torkel designing for himself and his son, like Alec Mansky, who originally built Plan Lifetime Advocacy Network to support his daughter. There's a fellow in the States who she almost lost her very young son in a car accident because there was someone who was older who was driving the other car and probably shouldn't have been driving. And her empathic response to the situation was not to seek litigation, but it was to say we need a way of seniors in our community to be able to get around and still be independent. So she created this basically a rideshare program, and I won't go into detail, but saying how do we make sure people can maintain their independence and get around, but that takes people off the road who shouldn't be driving. So it's a sense of empathy. It's driven from their own experience. It's designed not to be successful just to be successful for the sake of success, but to be successful because nobody else should experience what they experienced. There's a fellow in Mexico who really is creating the culture around organ donation because she lost her son and made this decision that she was going to save some lives with his organs.
So on an intuitive level, because they've experienced certain things firsthand, there's embedded human-centered design components, right? Now, we're hearing a lot about design thinking and human-centered design. What advice would you have for budding social entrepreneurs and people who want to work in the space of social change for the common good, the things that they need to think about in terms of human-centered design or design thinking? Like what are the important, what do you think they should know if they're going to try to address a problem and not feel like they have the answers and kind of parachute in? So
don't design for something you've never experienced or haven't gotten real firsthand experience built into. I see a lot of students developing solutions for problems they know nothing about. I'm not saying it doesn't work. Sometimes miraculously it works, but I think whether it's traditional entrepreneurship or any kind of new technology, even when people compare a few years ago, like Apple and BlackBerry and the way they designed their products and user design, like you need to design for who's going to be using it, and if you don't, you're going to become irrelevant. And I think that's even more important with social entrepreneurship.
And I think understanding the problem so deeply is a big part of it. And while understanding the problem, co-creating together with the people who will be using the solution, so that the solution is actually coming from within the community, for example, that will be benefiting from the solution. So it's not like a parachuting model, it's very much co-creating from the bottom up.
And sometimes it's a little nudge in the system, right? It's looking at one little part of the problem differently. I also love when people take an approach that worked over here and put it over here, right? So taking something that's actually, even with CSI's shared space model, a lot of people say, well, that's how scientists have always worked. That's how labs work, That's, well, great, but we haven't been using that for social innovation. So taking something that's a proven model and applying it someplace new can be a really effective way, and it doesn't require seeing a complete overhaul of a system, but is enough to shift it in a new direction.
So to anybody who's watching, who wants to get their feet wet and dabble in social change-making kind of work. Maybe they've been volunteering, but they don't recognize themselves as a change maker. Maybe social innovation sounds like what other people do when they're creative and not what they do naturally, they say, here's a problem and what's a workaround. What advice, as a final thought, would you give to people who are on the fringe and reaching in to do some work, some change maker work?
One thing I would say is think about a story that you would be really proud to tell about something that you've done. So instead of building your resume and saying, from 2015 to 2016, I worked at this organization and my responsibilities were, to saying, in 2016, I'm able to say that over the last year, I have developed this, I have launched this, I looked at this problem and created this. And I think if you're able to think about what you're doing in a way where you'll look back and say, I changed something as a result of what I did. It doesn't have to be the be-all and end-all. It's about creating those experiences so you know that you're capable of it, and you start to think in new ways. So I would say think about the story you want to tell, and spend time with creative people. Spend time with people who maybe make you feel small because they're so amazing, but at the same time you start to feel bigger and bigger just for spending time with them. I think that's how we feel when we're around the Ashoka Fellows, when we're around a lot of our partner organizations, when we're on university campuses where you have these 18-year-olds bubbling up with these ideas for social change, and you're thinking, when I was 18, I was, I didn't know. Yeah. So spend time with people who are bigger and creative, and think about the story you want to tell.
That's great.
Yeah, I would say get to know yourself. Think about what really is meaningful to you, and start anywhere. Just start. Just do it. Don't think too much about it. Just whether it's participating in a community association or on your kids' school council or whatever it may be, think about what kind of meaningful impact would you really like to have. It's not about what I could have on my resume. It is about what is most deeply impactful to my life and my surrounding community.
And it is so fitting that the idea is don't overthink it and over-strategize it. It's music to Henry Mintzberg's ears to end on this note. Thank you so much, really.